I'm usually not the superstitious type, but tonight's shift driving the cab changed that. The night was exceptionally foggy, the kind where the air feels thick and you can barely see 2 meters ahead. Every passenger I picked up, strangely more than usual, whispered the same address before sinking into a deep silence. The address, 45 Meridиan Hill, was known to me as a local legend. A sprawling mansion tangled in ghost stories, tied to a century-old mystery of a vanished family. Each time I typed the address into the GPS, a chill ran down my spine, yet my curiosity was piqued. The first passenger was an elderly woman dressed in a black lace dress, clutching a faded, leather-bound book. She didn't speak other than to give the address. As we approached the mansion, she vanished from my back seat as I pulled into the drive. I turned around bewildered, finding the car empty but for her book left on the seat. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light or my imagination. But then came the next passenger, a young man with a pallor to his skin that seemed almost unnatural. He too spoke only to give the address and disappeared as we arrived. With each new passenger, 6 in total, the pattern repeated. Each time an item was left behind: a silver locket, a gentleman's hat, a child's doll, a worn-out key, a pair of spectacles. Each object felt heavy with history, humming with a silent story. By the time the last passenger entered my cab, I was on edge, my hands trembling slightly as I drove. She was a young woman, her eyes sad and knowing. She broke the pattern by speaking softly during the drive. "You must wonder why we all go to the same place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "And why none of you stay in the car once we get there?" She smiled, a small, sorrowful curve of her lips. "Tonight is the centenary of the unsolved mystery. We're all tied to that house, bound by our last memories within its walls. We can't leave, not until the mystery is resolved." As we pulled up to the now dilapidated mansion, she handed me a crumpled newspaper clipping. It was an article about the family that disappeared the very same night a century ago. "Help us," she whispered, and then she too was gone. I was alone, standing in front of the mansion with the newspaper article and the objects left behind. The house loomed, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching. Driven by a force I couldn't explain, I used the old key to enter. Inside, the air was musty with decay, the silence a tangible weight. I moved from room to room, guided by an inexplicable knowledge of where to go. In what must have been a study, I found a hidden door behind a bookshelf, leading down to a cellar. The air grew colder as I descended. At the bottom, I found a room set up like a shrine, with pictures of each passenger from tonight, and their belongings set around an old, dusty tome. I opened the book to find it was a diary belonging to the last owner of the house. Reading by the light of my phone, the diary revealed the truth, a tale of betrayal and a hidden affair that led to a tragic family poisoning, a crime pinned on an innocent servant who cursed the family before taking her own life. The entries ended abruptly, but it was clear what needed to be done. I gathered the items, laid them in a circle, and set them ablaze, hoping to free the spirits tied to the house. The fire burned strangely bright, the flames reaching high into the air without consuming anything else. As the fire died down, the air shifted, growing lighter. I exited the cellar to see the dawn breaking, the first light in years to touch the forsaken mansion. As I left, I felt a sense of release, not just from the house, but within myself. I never drove the cab again after that night. The mansion was demolished shortly after, the land left barren, a silent testament to the mystery it once cradled. But sometimes, on foggy nights, I find myself driving past where 45 Meriddian Hill once stood, and I swear I can see figures in the mist, waving in gratitude, or perhaps in farewell. I'd been driving a taxi for decades, but I'd never encountered anything as bizarre as the mirror in my latest cab. It started on a dreary Tuesday evening when the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, setting the stage for a night I'd never forget. My first passenger was a middle-aged woman, her face drawn with fatigue. As I glanced in the rearview mirror to confirm she was settled, I froze. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the tired lines and graying hair of the woman who'd entered my cab. Instead, it showed a monstrous version of her, with bulging eyes and a twisted, gaping mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. I blinked, and the image snapped back to normal. Shaken, I dismissed it as a trick of my tired mind. Next, a businessman hopped in, talking loudly on his phone. Again, I peeked in the mirror. This time, his face was distorted beyond recognition. His eyes were sunk deep into their sockets, his skin sallow and pulled taut over his skull, and his lips moved in a horrifying grimace as he spoke. He looked perfectly normal as I eyed him directly, but the mirror told a different, ghastly tale. I shuddered, my hands trembling slightly on the wheel. Each passenger that night revealed a new terror in the mirror. A young couple showed as decaying corpses, their flesh rotting, eyes hollow. A cheery old man appeared as a sinister figure with dark, empty sockets where his eyes should be, and a smile that was too wide, too sharp. Panic clawed at my throat. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Or was the mirror cursed, revealing some hidden, malevolent essence of these people? Driven by a need to understand, I picked up an old, tattered book on supernatural occurrences at a rundown bookshop on my break. Flipping through the pages under the dim light of my cab's interior lamp, I learned of an ancient entity known as the Seer of Souls, a mirror spirit said to reveal the true nature of a person's soul through their reflection. Determined to rid myself of the mirror's torment, I decided to confront whatever force inhabited it. That night, as the city slumbered, I parked in a deserted alley, the book open on my lap, and stared into the mirror. "Show yourself," I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear that gripped me. "What do you want from me?" The air in the cab thickened, and the temperature dropped. The mirror rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond, and then, there it was. A face, neither male nor female, beautiful yet terrifying, its eyes piercingly bright and knowing. "You see them as they truly are," the spirit whispered, its voice echoing around the cab. "Each soul bears marks of their lives, their choices, their essence. You are chosen to see beyond the veil." "Why me?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "You have the gift of sight and the strength to face the truth," it replied, before the face faded, leaving the mirror blank. From that night on, every reflection showed the horrifying truth of my passengers, but understanding my purpose, I felt a resolve settle within me. I was a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to the hidden depths of humanity. Though it was a burden, it was also a gift, one that I would carry as I navigated the shadowy streets of the city, always aware of the unseen realities that lurk beneath the surface. I've driven these streets for years, and not once had they led me astray until tonight. I picked up my passenger, a nervous young woman named Sarah, around midnight. She was headed to the outskirts of the city, but no sooner had I entered the address into my GPS than the cab seemed to take on a life of its own. The steering wheel twisted violently out of my hands as the cab veered off the main road, turning onto a narrow, crumbling street I'd never noticed before. Sarah screamed, clutching her seat, as I fought to regain control, but the car refused my commands, accelerating into the darkness. "Where are we going?" Sarah's voice trembled with fear. I could only shake my head, mystified and terrified, as we plunged deeper into an abandoned part of the city where buildings stood hollowed out and consumed by ivy, windows like dark, watching eyes. The taxi's headlights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the graffiti-covered walls, whispering secrets in a language of decay. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with a chilling mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. "I've heard stories about this place," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the cab's rumbling engine. "They say it's haunted, that people who come here never leave." I wanted to reassure her, to tell her we'd be fine, but the truth was, I was as scared as she was. The cab slowed as we approached a large, derelict factory, its gates mysteriously swinging open, as if welcoming us to our doom. The car stopped, and despite my attempts to restart it, the engine was dead. The silence that followed was oppressive, a thick, tangible entity wrapping itself around us. "We need to get out," I said, my voice firm despite the fear that knotted my stomach. Sarah nodded, and we cautiously stepped out into the cold, damp air. The factory loomed before us, its broken windows gaping. A sudden noise from inside made us freeze, a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across a dusty floor. Then, a child's laughter echoed, chillingly out of place. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran, but no matter which direction we took, every turn seemed to lead us back to the factory. It was as if the building was reshaping itself around us, trapping us in an endless maze. Breathless and desperate, I spotted a small office with a door ajar. Inside, an old radio crackled to life as we entered, spitting out fragments of a decades-old broadcast. The room was filled with old maps of the city, including areas that no longer existed, except, it seemed, here. Poring over the maps, a realization dawned on me, a chilling understanding of our eerie surroundings. This part of the city had been abandoned after a devastating fire. Rumor had it that the mayor had hidden something valuable in this very factory, something worth haunting. Determined to find a way out, we searched the office and discovered a hidden tunnel beneath a loose floorboard. It led to the sewers, a possible escape route. As we navigated the dark, narrow passages, the sounds from the factory above faded into a suffocating silence. After what felt like hours, we emerged on the other side of the city, the lights of civilization twinkling in the distance like a beacon of hope. We never spoke of that night again, and I avoided driving after dark. The city reclaimed that haunted quarter, demolishing the factory and paving new roads. But sometimes, when I pass by the area where it once stood, I can't help but feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me, and I drive a little faster, always afraid that my car might once again turn against my will.